Rear Admiral retired Michael Hewitt is a native of Norfolk, Virginia, son of a career naval aviator. Michael holds a master's degree from the National Defense University and served as Deputy Director for Global Operations Directorate Joint Staff, the Pentagon in Washington. He was responsible to the Director for Operations and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff for oversight and coordination of worldwide operational matters. That included global reconnaissance operations, cyberspace operations, military information support operations, and special programs. Now he is the co-founder and CEO of IP3 International Peace, Power and Prosperity, an international energy and security company with the mission of bringing safe and secure nuclear power to the world's most critical markets. Michael retired from active duty in the Navy after 31 years of service, and we met in Odessa. So hopefully we can continue some of the conversation that was begun there. Michael, welcome to the channel.
Jonathan, thanks for having me, and thanks for teeing up. Um, what a great intro, and my mother would believe every word of it. And thank you for that. But yeah, I look back on my naval service as one of great gratitude, and I always tell people that I got much more out of the service than it got from me, but um, it gave me a foundation of what I'm doing in my company today.
And I have to ask as well, I mean, there are a lot of fantastic individuals in Odessa. There were some former prime ministers of Australia. There was Mike Pompeo, and it was very significant that he came and gave a strong address. I wouldn't call it pro-Ukrainian because everyone there is sort of pro-Ukraine or understands why it's important. But it was a very, very strong kind of showing. And yet, when we return back to the mainstream media and so on, yes, Ukraine punctuates every now and then with Operation Spiderweb or, the confrontation in the Oval Office. But apart from that, it seems to me that the strategic importance of the war in Ukraine is kind of absent in much of the coverage. What's your sense of that?
No, I agree, and it's been one of my frustrations going back to when, even before the war began, but certainly after the war began, of framing for the American people or the Western audience why Ukraine matters. And unfortunately, when you talk about Ukraine in terms of defeating Putin or destroying the Russian Empire or the concerns of tactical nuclear weapons, it's framed in a very, what I consider to be myopic way. And it doesn't really focus on the importance of that country geopolitically, the importance of that country as an ally. Um, and and after a year, you just kind of lose the attention span, let's say, of the American people and the Western audience as they move on to all the other issues that focus their time and attention. I do believe, though, that as we start to focus on, as I call, winning the war by winning the peace and creating true economic entanglement between US industries and Ukrainian industries, be it in the defense industry, be it in unmanned systems, be it in AI, be it in nuclear power, we're going to find an unbelievable strategic partner in Ukraine. That will then elevate the importance of the conversation beyond this kind of, like you said, um, in and out, haphazard discussion about the war. And again, it's a concern of mine that we have to frame it for the larger audience, and we haven't done that.
And it's an interesting question, isn't it? Because so much of the discourse seems to have been informed by, I won't call it a red herring, but the sort of the minerals deal, which, any profit from that is potentially many decades down the road. If you take out hydrocarbons, metals and minerals from trade with Russia or pre-war trade with Russia, there's almost nothing there. Certainly when it comes to the US and Russia is fairly minimal, factual trade, and I would argue trade opportunities because of the, fundamentally different sort of cultures in the country. Whereas Ukraine, yes, has a smaller population, but it seems to me that that represents far, far greater financial and commercial and military opportunities in future. Do you share that thought?
Absolutely do. And I think if you one of the things I don't think Putin calculated was losing the human capital, engineering, industrial talent of Ukraine in his invasion. He lost many of the key engineers and competencies that built his missile force, his nuclear force, his military force on the advanced side. And he didn't calculate that. Obviously, we are calculating that as a tremendous opportunity for alignment with the West. And on the minerals piece, and I've spoken on this quite a bit, you can look at the $15 trillion of critical minerals that are in Ukraine, particularly some of them that are very important to holding at risk China, such as graphite or titanium, also uranium, which is an important asset for any country's nuclear program. And the minerals deal to me was the US's ability to say, we want the United States to have the first crack at these minerals and do not let the Russians or the Chinese have access to them. And so when I look at, again, the why Ukraine matters, one of the most important aspects is these critical minerals, and they are up for grabs between the West and the East. And we really need to make sure that as part of this peace deal, that the United States, understanding all of the challenges of working in Ukraine, political risk, warfighting risk, corruption risk, and the like, the way you start to address these long-term issues that feel intractable in Ukraine is by having these massive commercial deals that bring Western competencies in, rigor, discipline, um, risk reduction. The fact is, there's going to be a lot of money thrown into Ukraine when this war is over, and we need to make sure that it is managed correctly. Other words, it may just vanish into the ether. And so the Ukrainians know this as much as the West knows this. So again, creating commercial partnerships on the back end of a peace deal, even if it's fragile, will start to set the conditions to reduce Putin's calculus of re-invading.
And there's another interesting process going on, isn't there? Which I think this is going to be sort of perhaps quite slow for the West to learn. But what we're seeing in Ukraine is an extraordinary process of innovation. And yes, there will be failures. There will be things that get invested in which don't work. But we're seeing an incredible development cycle from drones, the speed at which they're iterating hardware and software, and the speed at which the not even the state acquisition programs, but the role of civic society and tech industries, they're moving at a speed, I think, which few military acquisition programs or procurement processes in the West would really be able to cope with in their current state. How can we learn from that and then start to internalize the transformation in procurement that needs to take place in Western governments?
I, I I tell my Western friends that are involved in things like InQtel or the Defense Innovation Unit or the Special Forces ability to create capability rapidly that your system is wholly inadequate in Ukraine. In Ukraine, there isn't really a government procurement system that you can point towards. They're not busy trying to figure out value for money or figure out what a good competition would look like in a down select and the decision of which drone to go with. They're fighting for survival and leveraging the unbelievable innovation of Ukraine before the war and just repurposing it for the war is what they've done. And the proliferation of drone companies and obviously lethality and range, endurance and survivability. These are all things that were completely unheard of before this war. And so how do we take advantage of what has been a cycle of innovation that is second to none and then formalize that without ruining how it works is
Mm.
going to be the challenge. My concern is that a lot of the big defense firms that are eager to figure out how it can participate in these things will also hinder the advancement of these technologies. One of the things I focus on is ensuring that these companies in Ukraine that are fighting for survival can also survive their IP, their company, and not get swallowed up by the big defense firms. And then also the other thing that people don't seem to understand, most of this development is commercial off the shelf. So unlike large defense procurement programs that have ITAR compliance and CFIUS requirements and foreign military sales requirements, the first thing we do in the US is we make it prohibitively difficult to sell our defense tech to anybody. And then the prices go up. So in this particular case, the Ukrainians are building these drones and these autonomous systems with just commercial non-ITAR compliant capability. And to slow that down by us coming in and starting to call a piece of kit a military capability, which then means you can't sell it and rebuild it the way that the Ukrainians are doing it, would be a tremendous detriment uh, to the lessons learned that we're taking from Ukraine right now.
And there seems to be an extraordinary process, and it's one I sort of observed when I was in Lviv earlier in the year, and that is the government is starting to allocate funds based on results, but not necessarily tell the units what they have to use. They're allowed to procure, source, test, etc. equipment. They must keep certain verified records of the sort of hit rate or failure rates. And then they get not only rewarded by the government, of course, the charities or companies they're procuring from will get more funds based on that success rate. And not only that, then their recruitment. They will also get funds based on how successful they are at recruiting people in. So this seems to be the introduction, the injection of an extraordinary level of competition. Again, yes, it comes from survival, but actually, are we going to need to learn some of these agile, highly democratic techniques in order to potentially survive a 21st century war?
The term that you just captured that we would use in the military is measures of effectiveness. And we often get caught up in measures of performance, which is simple to say, I've flown 1,000 sorties, I've done this, I've done this, I've done this, but with very little measures of effectiveness of what were the outcome of those sorties. What the Ukrainians have developed, not surprisingly, because they are just cutting edge engineers, is they have a very detailed way of measuring every sortie, every mission, every piece of equipment that was added. Why did it work? Why did it fail? And then how do you improve upon it and then return it to the battlefield almost instantaneously? And because they have this rigorous measures of effectiveness capability born out of the need to pace the threat in such real time, that it's a model that can actually help build out their companies. Because when you talk about what's working and what's not working, it's very nebulous. But if you can show and demonstrate that this is why this sortie worked, this is the improvement that I made to this sortie, and in some cases, because you're so detailed in that, you can start to figure out maybe how the Russians are countermanding your system, either with an electronic warfare system or maybe a sabotage piece of equipment or a chip. This is an unbelievable new industry on new industry. And one of the downsides to this is that the Russians are doing the same thing. So the Russians are using the same commercial off-the-shelf technologies that the Ukrainians are using. And unfortunately, a lot of this technology is coming from US companies. And so what we also need to do, and when I talk to the Ukrainians about what is it we could do to be the most impactful to help you, they said, stop the Russians from using US equipment or Western equipment to build their own drones. And it's a very important point. So as we build out the fidelity to understand the supply chain, then we can start to go after in almost a name and shame campaign to say, hey, Company X from the United States, you know your chips are actually supporting the Russians in their UAV development. but we have to put the evidence package together to do that. And the only way to do that is to have this measures of effectiveness capability that the Ukrainians have created.
Another interesting process as well, isn't it? Which again, I think is going to be very hard for Western procurement to gear up to. One is the asymmetric effect, the ability for relatively low cost units, drones, and other equipment to take out incredibly expensive platforms. And then you have the problem of anti-air systems costing more than the shaheeds that they're taking out. So it's turning the economics of warfare on its head. But it seems at its heart, not only is the Ukrainian process driving innovation, there is a constant need to also drive down the unit cost to get a lot more for a lot less. That seems to be the very antithesis of Western military procurement processes.
It absolutely is. And this is one of the reasons that we have to be very protective of the ecosystem that the Ukrainians have created. Because left to its own devices, it'll get swallowed up and more or less destroyed by the big defense industries. And so we have to be very protective of this and realize that what Zelensky wants to do with his military industrial base is kind of threefold. One is scale, build out more of the things that are needed. And we're not talking about innovative things. We're talking about 155 artillery shell factories and things that have been grossly depleted out of NATO and the EU since this war
Armored
began.
vehicles, the artillery units, that kind of stuff,
Everything,
yeah.
just the basic blocking and tackling of warfare. And if we didn't learn that we are grossly underfunded, and you could argue that part of this 2%, 3%, 4% of GDP for NATO nations is as much an understanding that we were caught flat-footed in the amount of military hardware that's needed to fight Russia, even in a limited invasion of Ukraine. The second is the industrial base. Ukraine, before the war, has an amazing defense industrial base. Most of it was supporting Russia, but a lot of it was actually supporting America. Partnerships with Northrop Grumman and Lockheed Martin and Boeing in Ukraine have been ongoing for years, particularly in things such as space and missile systems. So we need to go rebuild that. And again, this is how you make Ukraine sovereign within its own military industrial complex. And the third is this innovation piece. How do we capture it, protect it, and allow Ukraine to be advantaged by this incredible capability that they've created and not let it vanish into some EU procurement process? And so those are kind of the three things that we think about in ensuring that Ukraine is a sovereign nation militarily, which I believe is actually more important than focusing on joining NATO right now. Um, be able to fight your own war in the future, and let's task organize Ukraine to do that. And that may be the best investment that the West makes in all of this is ensuring that Ukraine can actually take on Russia the next time they have to.
And that's an interesting point, isn't it? Because NATO, there still seems to be, dare I say it, the sort of institutional muscle memory in NATO of it being effective and all the rest of it. The real test is whether Russia thinks NATO is effective and united, and whether it thinks that Article 5 still holds any deterrent power. Now, clearly that hasn't vanished entirely, but it's certainly, nowhere near as strong as it was during the Cold War or even a few years ago. So what do we do then to deter Russia if those traditional tools are losing their effectiveness?
I I share the opinion that as we move into more asymmetric warfare or hybrid warfare, are less territorial gains and more maybe economic, commercial, or non-kinetic warfare, cyber and the like,
Political
that
destabilization, one of
all of
those is
that,
key part, yeah.
how do you define that in terms of Article 5? It's very difficult. We've seen a couple use cases, such as Georgia and others, where there was a claim that, oh, this particular attack should have triggered Article 5, and it didn't. So I think NATO is playing catch up a bit in terms of what defines Article 5 going forward. I also think that I am quite worried that not all NATO nations are the same when it comes to this. If I'm Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania, I may be on the outside looking in, wondering if Article 5 would be triggered even if Russia invaded my country. And that's not a foregone conclusion that it would. That worries me greatly. And if that is the case, then the alliance really has no foundation. And so NATO really needs to think about what its role is in the future because it certainly, in my opinion, is watching Ukraine fight its war for them right now.
And because you've looked into, cyber, hybrid warfare and all these aspects, I won't even ask you how likely is it that Russia will challenge Article 5, because I think that's maybe almost an inevitability, but certainly they're challenging it in the sort of sub-threshold area of triggering Article 5. And they seem to be pushing in every single way they possibly can to test our resilience and willingness to the point where, what would trigger it? They seem prepared to push right up to that line. Is there anything notable that you've seen in the last couple of years in terms of that testing, and where would you expect it to go in the coming, I won't even say years, months, I think is the time frame we need to look at.
It the ultimate test of whether Putin is challenged by NATO, I think, was his invasion of Ukraine, even though Ukraine is not a NATO nation. It was a sovereign nation that was taken over by a belligerent nation. And at least in the attempt, that is of grave concern, even because NATO stood by and watched this happen. And I'm not just saying on the day of the invasion, what Putin did was amass forces on the border for well over a year. He watched the landscape quite closely with the abandonment of Afghanistan. He floated trial balloons up with respect to what a reaction to his invasion may look like. And he got the answer that maybe he wasn't even expecting, which was, well, it depends on how big the invasion is. Or, in other words, here's what we won't do. We won't create a no-fly zone. We won't put troops in harm's way. We won't do this. We won't do
We
this.
won't go nuclear, but
We won't go nuclear. We won't do these things. And so if you're Putin and you amass the sheer scale of troops on the border that you've amassed, you're almost forced to invade at that point because you weren't given an incentive not to. And he probably was somewhat surprised by that. And again, I believe that geopolitically that China and Russia as authoritarian governments are trying to displace the West as the democracies of the 21st century. And that to me is the strategic play here. The tactical play is Ukraine, but the strategic play is can we demonstrate that the West is not reliable when it comes to defending you? And I would argue they may have proven that point quite well.
and that's unfortunate, isn't it? Because whereas Putin really underestimated Ukraine, in fact, he had a complete blind spot when it came to Ukraine being able to fight back for itself. This whole thing could possibly have been avoided not by the West saying they're going to commit troops or anything, simply by saying they would arm Ukraine to the hilt to defend itself. And of course, that was absent as well.
The 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 Colin Powell doctrine of warfare, which is warfare is the last resort. But if in fact you decide to go to war, you go with an understanding, a clear understanding of the ends, ways, and means of that campaign, and then you win decisively. And then you exit. None of those things were put into play. As a matter of fact, this is the first combined arms campaign that's been fought really since World War II in a warfighting environment that America and NATO would have never fought themselves. We would not go to war without air cover. We would not go to war without being able to reach into the command and control and the logistics of the nation you're fighting to disrupt it. We would not do what we asked Ukraine to do. Yet we did it with the full ends being defeat Putin. So we absolutely handed them an unexecutable campaign and then were complaining that they weren't making progress. And so it was incredibly frustrating to me to realize that what we did was we asked Ukraine to fight our war in a way that we would have never fought.
which is extraordinary. And yes, I mean, I saw some of the inputs into the wargaming scenarios around the summer offensive that had been overhyped in 23. And of course, it turns out in hindsight, the inputs and the assumptions were completely wrong, and the estimates of Russia's capability also completely wrong as well. So, of course, wrong input is going to get the wrong output there. But what we also perhaps fail to see, and I'm interested in this because I know you've done sort of, war modeling, war fighting scenario stuff. When you have operations such as the Hamas Beeper operation, when you have Operation Spiderweb, and the one that didn't, I don't know why didn't get so much attention was the drones in grain cars. And now you have reports today that Israel seems to have also potentially used hidden sort of drone capability on the territory of Iran. How do you modify your wargaming scenarios to include these highly improbable, highly innovative and unpredictable kind of events?
It is quite amazing what Israel did to take on the proxy networks, particularly demonstrating that they could go deep into Iran without American support, other than maybe missile defense for retaliation, and be effective. Um, the attacks last night were really a remarkable ability to go into Iran, take out key leadership structures, take out a large portion of their nuclear infrastructure, and as far as I can tell, return home safely with dozens of fighter aircraft. And that was done because it was done in concert with this unbelievable innovative use of drones, troops on the ground, insurgents, and those things were planned years in advance. And when you look at the Hezbollah attacks with the pagers and the phones and I mean, and it that was probably 10 years in the making. And so it's interesting how you can be planning for something for so many years and then inculcate unbelievable new technology into the final execution of it. The United States would be wholly unable to do that. And part of that is because, and my complaint has been for years and years, is we don't focus on what I call phase zero. So phase zero of any military campaign is the precursor to kinetic action. And what Ukraine did in Russia and what Israel has obviously done throughout the Middle East is an amazing phase zero campaign, preparing the battlefield for hopefully not kinetic conflict, but if you have to do it, you're ready to do it. And the US military spends very little time on phase zero because it doesn't buy F-35s. What buys F-35s is major conflicts. And so we have to break the cycle of spending unbelievable amounts of money on hardware that may never be used in a 21st century war.
And this could perhaps also be applied in some ways to the strategic level because we have this fundamental strategy. And I can see why China is seen as a peer adversary, and I can see why, the core focus is on deterring China, containing China, um, as its tremendous sort of growth in not just economic power but military power, and I would say malevolency has grown over the years as it's become far more dictatorial under Xi. But we do have a nominal alliance of authoritarian states, which I think is called the Rinks.
Yep.
And you have North Korea, you have Iran, you have Russia. And they are quite clearly and demonstrably in an alliance against Western interests, against Israel, against Europe, and against the US. So no matter what is sort of said publicly, no matter the sort of strategic idea of peeling Russia away, that to me seems like a strategic flaw because Russia is aligned with authoritarian, malicious, anti-rule of law states. And there really is nothing that is going to make them suddenly become an ally or one that shares our values. Now, they have absolute contempt for our values. So what would be your approach to strategy here? And how do you think, especially the US, needs to perhaps sort of factor this in to its core strategic focus?
I have talked quite a bit about China writes their doctrine, they publish their doctrine, and then they execute their doctrine. We just don't bother to read it. And the doctrine of unrestricted warfare, which essentially says we will win the war without ever firing a shot using economic warfare, information warfare, cognitive warfare, and the like, is exactly what they're doing. And they do it quite well. And they have two major campaign plans that one could argue is very effective. One is called Made in China 2025, which set out 10 years ago to say we will be dominant in every advanced technology the world needs by 2025. And they're basically there. And then also the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a major campaign to become economically and commercially aligned with the emerging markets. So I think the outshoot of those things is these new alliances that you're referring to that lean more into authoritarian or belligerent states than they do Western free market enterprise. And they're proving that in some cases they're more reliable than the West. And I think this is all part of the Chinese campaign to displace Western democracies with authoritarian governments. And a campaign such as Ukraine allows them to exercise their muscles in that, um, and really prove is the West a reliable partner or not. And I do believe that a lot of the kind of internalization of our democracies in the UK and the US in particular are a manifestation of Chinese strategy to create this kind of confusion and lack of purpose by the free market enterprises. And I would finish by saying we aren't paying attention to where the GDP and the emerging markets are, and they're not in Western Europe. I mean, the GDP and the population is somewhat stagnant there. But where's the population growing? In places like the global south or in the Middle East or in Africa to be certain. And that's where Russia, China, and the BRICS are focusing their attention. And we are not. And so that is really the strategy that the Chinese have laid out that we should be very attendant to right now. And and I think this is why this idea of economic entanglement and economic support and getting away from single mandate campaigns such as climate change and focusing more on reliable power for the world will serve us well. And the Chinese right now have the high ground on that.
They're not skeptical about nuclear. They've got a massive electric vehicle technology, battery technology industry, etc., etc. Plus with lots of dirty fuels still as a core
I think
part of what they do. But
90 gigawatts of coal were built in China over the last year. So, to, to- and they are addressing the need for much more power on this planet. I mean, it really is somewhat just delusional to sit here and talk about decarbonization when we have over 1 billion people with no electricity and we have 2 billion people that live on $2 a day. And the Chinese are focusing on that through their own methodology, but we have to understand that as I've written, this is a great power competition between China and America. It's not a Cold War, the way we think about the Cold War. It really is a great power competition. And the winner of that great power competition will be chosen among the weaker nations. The weaker nations will decide who the winner is. And we better start to pay attention to that.
And of course, more electricity, more resources, more rare minerals, all of these also ladder up to the other race that's taking place. And I know that both Biden and Trump's administration actually have this in common, is they're concerned about the race to who can achieve general artificial intelligence first. And of course, that is a huge energy hungry process, a mineral hungry process. And it's thought that arguments range, but the first power to achieve that may have an almost unbridgeable gap within weeks of achieving that milestone. If we look at Operation Spiderweb, this is one of the first large-scale operations involving some autonomous intelligence within the drones. And by a curious irony, which again the media hadn't paid much attention to, but I thought was absolutely delicious, those intelligences or autonomous intelligences were trained on an example of the Russian bomber in an aviation museum in Ukraine. The only bomber that actually wasn't sort of cut up, chopped up, or sent back to Russia. So that's kind of beautiful there. But seriously, there must be a huge amount of concern about, how this is going to proliferate, how it's going to scale. And if the Ukraine war carries on for another, Russia's war in Ukraine, I should say, carries on for another year, 2 years, we're going to see autonomous drone swarms and all sorts of new technology really making their appearance on the battlefield.
The the biggest challenge we have, whether it's developing AI or developing deep neural nets or developing autonomous systems, or you'll hear this term compute at the edge, they're all back to the same basic problem, which is reliable, resilient, denied environment electricity. And we have gotten away from that over the last 60 to 70 years, and the Chinese have not. And they understood that fundamentally reliable power that can't be disrupted through a cyber attack or some other type of less than complex attack is the key. And now with AI, which is a 10x demand per megabit of power to do that kind of processing, the limiting factor is having reliable power. Our focus, and again, I think why I love Ukraine for this conversation is the future of doing AI is what we call islanded power using small modular reactors. The marriage of AI to nuclear has already been consummated by large Western companies. But the deficit we enjoy right now to stay in a first mover position around AI is enormous. Even though they will say, oh, the West has all the technology, we don't have the operational way to power that AI to take it to the battlefield. I mean, if you look at the Golden Dome conversation that's happening right now, which is a complete rebuild of our homeland defense systems, it has two fundamental problems. You have to bring compute to the edge to be able to address hypersonics and these new weapon systems. But to bring compute to the edge, you need a tremendous amount of power that you don't have at the edge. And so we're stuck in this massive dilemma right now where we need to understand that reliable, resilient power, robust overcapacity of power is the only way to bring AI to the battlefield. And why I love Ukraine for this future development is they've already figured out that you need decentralized power. Their 50% of their electricity today is nuclear power. And thank goodness, because it was one of the ways they were able to hold off Putin, even though he took over Zaporizhia. But on top of that, they are the AI center of the world. So the marriage of nuclear to AI and then this kind of repeatable model of islanded power for high performance compute could actually be built in Ukraine faster than anywhere else. And so, yes, this is a major problem that the West has because we were fixated for the last decade on climate change as the sole mandate of driving our energy mix. And at least now, everyone seems to be comfortable that you need more of an all of the above strategy for your energy. And if one thing Putin did for us in this invasion of Ukraine, two things went away that day. One was COVID, and the other was climate change. And everybody turned their attention to needing reliable power. And as I have said, sovereignty is defined not by your border, but by your ability to keep your own lights on. And that to me is the fundamental lesson learned we should be taking from all of this is that we have a large way to go to get back into first mover position in terms of AI.
And the other conversation, which perhaps is happening more slowly but should really kind of speed up, is onshoring sort of the industrial base required to power sort of military tech industry. And of course, Ukraine has lost some of its industrial base through to Russian aggression. Germany, fortunately, hadn't decommissioned everything, and I read the rather interesting phrase that Volkswagen is no longer producing cars; it's making tanks now. Whether you should be concerned about that or not, I mean, as long as they're on our side, I guess it's okay. But we had basically decided again through the climate change prism, this is kind of hypocritical, that these dirty industries we no longer wanted to have anything to do with them. We were quite happy for them to be relocated to other countries to relocate our dirty problems somewhere else. Now we realize that without these base industries, we have a real problem against countries like Russia, aggressive imperial entities.
Well, Russia has survived this war because they're a petro economy and they've been able to build out their petro economy during the conflict because countries that definitely don't support Russia, but they need that power. They need that resource. And the Chinese have known that, and the Chinese are building coal-fired plants every day, all the while flooding the market with very cheap renewable energy components in a way to coax us into believing it's the baseload form of power when in fact it's not. And again, I think the wake-up call has occurred, and I'm quite excited that NATO, who 3 years ago said climate change was their number one existential threat, is now realizing that perhaps that's not their number one existential threat. Perhaps believing it's your number one threat is your problem. And so addressing the need for a robust military capability, but also knowing that you need to have reliable sovereign power in form of electricity to be able to defend your country and then to project power forward. Putin uses the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. That was his way to project power into Western Europe. It wasn't tanks and guns. It was, I will control whether you can turn your lights on or not. And the Chinese, in particular, have set the conditions for this. They were doing it with Huawei and 5G. Now they're doing it with nuclear power. And they own a large chunk of the UK's nuclear power industry right now in terms of Hinkley Point and Sizewell. And I just think that is a wholly uncomfortable place to be as a sovereign nation. And so we need to address the fact that Russia and China have beaten us to the punch on this, but it's time for us to recalibrate and focus on our own energy sovereignty.
And let's turn back to that NATO idea as a military alliance. It's sort of curious, yes, that climate change is the main concern, but this happened at the very time where Putin deconstructed any vestiges of civic society and nascent democracy in his country, murdered journalists and opponents, invaded first Chechnya, then Ukraine, then obviously Georgia, Ukraine, and at the same time, and this calls upon some of your work in the Navy. They have invested massively in hybrid operations to manipulate electoral processes, including in the US, to try to disrupt the normal functioning of our institutions and processes. Whether they have succeeded and to what extent, obviously, is debatable. But the fact the intent is there, that is now beyond any doubt. And why was that not seen as the number one priority? Why do we not still have an extraordinary sense of urgency when it comes to the malignant threat from Russia?
It is interesting that they tried to frame Putin's interference in the American election as supporting Trump, or really he was doing what he's been doing all along, which is trying to undermine the faith and confidence of the West in their own governments. And they will continue to do that. They don't care about who wins the election. They care about creating confusion and concern and lack of confidence in our institutions. And they've just been able to take advantage of the new capability to do that with cyberspace, with social media, with publicly available information. Meanwhile, the West is woefully behind in understanding A, how they're using that capability, or B, using it ourselves to fight back. And this is a key area that we have to focus on, is that the Chinese and the Russians have completely institutionalized how to use what I call cognitive warfare in a non-military way to win the war without firing the shot. And I would say they've been quite successful in that. They convinced us that climate change was more important than reliable power, and we bought into that for a long, long time. But if you look at India and China and the nations that produce the most carbon, they aren't really that focused on it. And so I think as an energy mix, we have to focus on all the above, and abundant and baseload and clean energy all at the same time, because the emerging markets are looking for that. But it is fascinating how we have turned a blind eye to the advances in non-kinetic capability that really is driving the the campaigns. It's not taking land anymore. And so yes, it's a fascinating. Are we going to man, train, equip, and organize ourselves going forward as Western militaries and alliance to the fact that this phase zero operation, this hybrid operation, the little green men, is the future, and they will continue to do that. And they're doing it with Wagner Group and with the Chinese quite effectively throughout Africa right now. And again, I think it's an area of grave concern that we should focus on, and then be very public with the American people and the Western democracies to say, look, this is what you enjoy so many freedoms right now that are really putting us at risk. And we have to just kind of measure publicly available information and privacy versus how the Chinese and the Russians use that to their advantage against our own democracy.
And they've shown themselves very capable of investing in assets. Now, I don't want to be too speculative because despite his echoing of Kremlin narratives, we don't have proof of Russian support for Tucker Carlson. The narratives themselves can be corrosive, but we do have Tenet Media, and we do have some areas where the link between Russian investment, Russian handling, in fact, of the narrative has been demonstrably proved. How do we balance the need for sort of freedom of speech and the more, I would say, extreme libertarian approach to that, compared to the ability of our enemies to massively invest in speech, no longer free speech, but I would call it paid speech. And yet we have a real problem distinguishing between these two and moderating, which makes us actually extremely vulnerable in the current space.
It's it's a tremendous problem that we enjoy right now because of the inherent protection of freedom of speech and the inherent protection of privacy by our citizens against the backdrop of how that same freedom puts us at risk to our own sovereignty. And I saw this firsthand when I was developing the first real use of cyber tools to defeat Al Qaeda. And what Al Qaeda was doing back in the early 2000s was taking full advantage of the freedom of expression that Americans enjoyed, and they were using it against us in terms of building desecration videos or recruitment videos or propaganda videos, and proliferating them throughout the West on our own servers. Because what they knew to be a fact was the safest place to operate a terrorist organization was on a US server, because the US server was protected by all kinds of freedoms of individual liberty. And so we have to realize that in some cases, our own freedoms put us at odds with our own sovereignty. And it is going to be very challenging for us to deal with the fact that publicly available information that each and every one of us have given to the system through use of iPhones and things of that nature have put our country at risk against the lack of freedoms in China and Russia, where they're not concerned about civil liberties. So it's going to be a real interesting balancing act. How do we protect free market enterprise and civil liberties at the same time realizing it has made us quite vulnerable to our own sovereignty? And that is going to be, I think, a fascinating part of the next 10 years of developing warfighting capability. Because if we do not address this issue, the Russians and the Chinese will continue to dominate the cognitive warfare space while we sit back and contemplate kinetic activity, which is what they want us to do. Build more tanks while they infiltrate our social media. And we really have to address this as a warfighting requirement.
And of course, we don't really have any offensive operations anymore. We don't look to do regime change or to undermine regimes such as Lukashenko and Putin. Whereas I would argue that we should be actively involved in that, and but intelligently, not in the malicious way they are. The last question here is, what is the evidence you see of alignment between China and Russia? We certainly see that Russia's information operations are far more aggressive, far more intrusive. But, could there be some kind of alignment between them, the sort of good cop, bad cop kind of approach? And how formal or informal might that be?
I I actually believe that we in some ways push Putin into the hands of China through our aggressive gobbling up of Warsaw Pact countries, of not recognizing that Russia, at least at the end of the Cold War, was interested in becoming a Western type country. And we didn't really avail them the opportunity to do that as much as we should have in retrospect. Not saying they would change their behavior, but at least we didn't give them a chance to change their behavior. In some cases, we instilled in Putin that it was a mistake to drop to support the fall of the Soviet Union. Um, that being said, I don't believe that the Russia-China alliance is without certain challenges between those two countries that we need to really focus in on. But the clear evidence to me that they have aligned strategically is if you just, let's just use Ukraine. The Sochi Olympics occur and then we invade Crimea. And China and Russia had put a very strong global statement together in 2014, just prior to that invasion. Well, if you look at the invasion of Ukraine, it was on the heels of a major announcement at the Beijing Olympics in 2022 of the alignment of Russia and China as the authoritarian democracies of the 21st century. And so again, they basically telegraph their doctrine and then execute it. And right now, it is a very, very strong alliance. It doesn't mean we can't fracture that alliance. And in some cases, it doesn't mean we can't work with that alliance. I think we have to, it's not so binary. I mean, I believe there are areas of cooperation with Russia and China, and I know it's no one wants to hear that right now, but there are certain domains such as space and advanced research and engineering that we may be able to find common ground with each other in. And ultimately, we may be able to, I would like to see us attract Russian interest back to the West. It's untenable right now to think about that, but ultimately, the great power competition is the United States and China. And so, how do you pull as many of the alliances your way as you can is really the key focus going forward.
Michael, Thank you so much for this conversation today. There is a lot to think about there, a lot to digest, and I think there's a lot of fascinating information there about, especially the mechanics of procurement and, of course, energy, which are going to be critical to the world moving forward, and the competition between great powers, whether it is kinetic in the case of Russia as it currently is, or whether it is on more economic competitional fronts. Thank you so much for coming on the channel. It was a tremendous pleasure.
Thank you, Jonathan. I enjoyed it.